so we can maximize our time together. I will start with just sharing my screen here and a couple of slides. So let me just get this started here. So wonderful to see so many of you in this room. If I haven't met you before, my name is Allison Pearson. I'm the manager with the Children and Youth Planning Table, and just really excited to be here with you today and to be introducing this next segment, which is about meaningful youth engagement and adult allyship. And we're talking specifically about that program level consideration up against that system level consideration when it comes to actions. And we have an amazing panel together that are going to introduce themselves in a moment. A little bit more about me. So I identify as a white cisgendered woman. I live in Waterloo. I'm also a parent of 2 kids. So a little bit about me. Before I turn it over to them, I'd like to offer a territorial acknowledgement from where we're broadcasting here, at least in Waterloo region today. And we're acknowledging the land on which we are broadcasting as the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and the Neutral people. We acknowledge the enduring presence of the Indigenous people with whom we share the land today, their achievements, and their contributions to our community. We offer this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of Canada. If you have other acknowledgements, if you're joining us from out of the region and you'd like to add that in the chat, that would be wonderful to add to the experience. A few little logistics before we start. As with the other sessions, we're asking folks to keep their videos on if they feel comfortable and open to doing so, just so it adds to the sense that we're in the same space together. But please do keep yourself muted so that we can all hear really clearly what the panelists or speakers are saying. As you all heard a moment ago, the sessions are being recorded and the chat will be exported. That chat area has been really lively today, which is wonderful. So keep sharing your comments, your thoughts, your insights, your questions. You'll see right there an invitation to kick us off to share something you're grateful or hopeful for as we launch into this session. And you know that the Backbone team is working behind the scenes to pull all that input into a shared space. That's our collective insights space on the Google Drive. So if you want to hop on over there and take a look at what colleagues are sharing, you're welcome to. You're also welcome to connect with your colleagues on social media if that's something you're into. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And my job is to toss it over to Neha, who is going to launch into the panel.
Hi, so I'm Neha, and I'm really excited to be moderating this panel today. A little bit about me, quick intro. I identify as a 19-year-old Indian woman. I currently go to the University of Waterloo, and I'm in my 2nd year of the Accounting and Finance program. I also work for Horizon as a youth program facilitator, and also work with the Lyle Hallman Foundation. Abby somewhere in here, doing work with implementing youth voice into decision making. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm excited to kickstart this panel. So let's start with some introductions. Joanna, do you want to start?
Sure, I'm happy to start. Thank you, Neha. Hello, everybody. I'm really excited to be here in a room full of folks who are just super brilliant in this space and in this work, both on the panel and as part of the audience. So thank you all so much for being here with us today. My name is Joanna, she, her pronouns, and I am the Youth Engagement and Systems Lead, part of the CYPT Backbone team and Horizon Family and Community Services. I am a cisgendered white woman. I'm the daughter, the Canadian-born daughter of immigrant parents, and I'm a settler on these traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples.
Great, thank you, Joanna. Michael, do you want to go next?
Certainly. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is indeed Michael. I work at a place called the Waterloo Region Crime Prevention Council. For about 25 years, we work with 1 foot in government, 1 foot out of government and in community to address sort of root causes of crime, victimization, and fear of crime. So lots of downstream interest, but certainly very much interest in upstream approaches to prevention, driving always towards equity. I would identify as a cis male. My parents emigrated here separately in the 50s and somehow ended up in Waterloo region. And I come to you live today from scenic downtown Kitchener.
Awesome. Ilona, do you want to go next?
Hi, so my name is Ilona Doherty, and I'm the Managing Director of the Youth and Innovation Project at the University of Waterloo, which is a research project that I'm excited to share more about that looks at the role of 15 to 25-year-olds in society and the economy. So I identify as a white, cisgendered, straight woman who grew up in rural and northern Canada, and that perspective of having grown up in remote parts of Canada really informs my work. And I also identify as somebody with a physical disability, which also really informs my work and how I move through the world.
Thanks for sharing. Sharif, do you want to take it away? Is Sharif here?
Yeah, I'm here. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's hard on this Brady Bunch that we've got going on right now. So yes, hi everyone. My name is Sharif Mahdi. I use he, him, and il pronouns. I love these identity questions. I have to tell you, it makes me feel really, really good to be able to share these parts of so you really know who we are. I work with an organization called the Students' Commission of Canada. We're a national charity that purposely works with other organizations to ensure that young people's voices are heard and valued. I'm really excited to be connected to you folks. I've heard such great things about you, and I've worked with some of you before, so I'm really excited to be here today. In terms of some of the things that place me, the identity pieces that place me, I identify as a cisgender male. I am biracial. My mother was born in Stittsville, Ontario, and my father was born in Cairo, and they met at the YMCA, and that's a story for another panel. And I'm definitely a settler, and I'm on Treaty 13 territory, which is also known as Toronto. And so I want to make sure that you're aware of that. And I'm an adult, which is sad to say, but I'm definitely an adult. And I'm also a member of the LGBTQ2S+ community, and I was raised Muslim. So I sometimes joke with my colleague Kwaku that I'm a bit of a walking intersection of identities, which have really informed you know, my work and have really helped me to kind of see things from a different perspective. I have to admit that when I was younger, I wasn't proud of my Arab identity. And as I've grown up, I've become much more proud of that identity. And it's really helped to shape who I am. So thank you.
Thanks, Sharif. Last but not least, we have Kwaku.
Students Commission of Canada. Sharif and I work really close with one another, and the work I do is focused in youth engagement and leading the Canada We Want project, which engages young people, young Canadians from coast to coast to coast to ensure their voices are heard on issues that impact them the most. The Students Commission is focused on Nobody's Born a Racist 2.0, which is a 10-year strategy to address systemic and structural racism in Canada. So a lot of really important work going. I identify as a cisgendered Black man from the community from Treaty 13 in Toronto, specifically the neighborhood of Rexdale. And so Rexdale and my identity really informs the work I do in regards to supporting young people furthest away from opportunity and ensuring that we're building more spaces for young people to have their voices heard in decision-making spaces. And so, yeah, thank you.
Perfect, thanks, Kwaku. So clearly we have some very amazing, insightful panelists here today with us, and I'm very excited to listen to the conversations that are about to be had. So without further ado, let's get started with the first question. So what does systems level change mean? Whoever wants to take a stab first.
I can jump in. if nobody else wants to jump in first. So systems level change, I'm excited to hear, because I think there are a lot of different things that this can mean. But the definition that that really grounds my work and that I've found really useful is a definition that's used by the authors of Getting to Maybe, which is a book about social innovation. And one of the lead authors was Frances Wesley, who was a professor at the University of Waterloo. And the definition that they use is, you know that systems change is happening. You know you're working on systems change when the way that resources are flowing in a society shift. So usually that's about money, right? So if money starts going to people who didn't typically have access to money or other kinds of resources and support, then you know systems change is happening. So if you're working on shifting resource flows, you're working on systems change. And the second piece they talk about is power. So again, if the kinds of people or the kinds of groups who have power in a society start to shift, then again, you know a systems change is happening. So, so I think that I find that a really helpful kind of definition to think about what level and what kinds of change we're talking about when we're talking about systems change. But I know there's a lot of other nuance to it, so I'm excited to hear what other folks have to say.
I can go, Ilona, after you, if that's good. I think you started us off really well with that definition in terms of power flow and money. Power and money as the kind of key indicator of what flows. Just making sure you can hear me all okay. Yeah, great. Awesome. So yes, so you know, one of the things that we've been thinking about is 21st century governance and decision making. And, you know, one of the theories that really gravitated towards us was a theory called evolutionary governance theory, which is about shifting governance decision-making away from rule-making, which is what it was a lot of in the 20th century, setting up, you know, institutions and structures, to a 21st century viewpoint, which is the coordination of diverse stakeholder viewpoints, and looking at, you know, why it's so great. We started off with those, you know, I think I received 10 different identity questions for Monica in the lead up to this. And I think that's really awesome because diversity can hit so many visible and invisible elements. And so what is the role of our institutions in coordinating those different viewpoints? Another kind of piece that's really important in terms of systems change. So one is the coordination of diverse stakeholder viewpoints, and who plays that coordinating role is really, really important. And when that person plays that coordinating role, or that institution, how are they distributing power versus how are they hoarding power? To Ilona's, just to reinforce Ilona's definition there. The other piece to kind of think about is complexity and complexity science, and the fact that human beings are actually kind of opposed to complexity. They don't like complexity, and their tendency is to try to simplify complexity when we should actually be trying to enhance our systems and our structures to reflect the complexity of the services that we're in. And so what does that mean on a really nitty-gritty kind of granular level in the work that we do? It means that systems change is messy, that it requires patience, that it requires persistence. So patience and persistence, two different things. Sometimes the ball has to drop with a pivotal kind of moment. And it really requires, in our view at the Students' Commission, and I know the panelists that I'm with, we're all in consensus on this, also involves working intergenerationally in order to try to achieve the change. Young people have been at the forefront of the youth movements that have transformed systems in our world, and have been really well supported by adults to do, and when they're really well supported, by adults to make those changes, that's when we really start to see the power and the resource flow happen. So summarizing that all together, messy, level up to the complexity, be patient, be persistent, and work with young people to try to achieve the change, because in history, when we do that, good things tend to happen.
I'm gonna jump in and actually offer some healthy pushback on what Sharif mentioned, just because it's two things that we could actually point out that actually really help each other, and just to spice it up a little bit. So I forgot to mention, I identify as a young person, and the way that experience sort of ties into what I want to say is around the both need for systems level change to actually be current and right now, and how it compares to, you know, the generational long-term changes. And so working at the Students Commission, seeing firsthand for a pretty long time, seeing the importance of the patients and how that actually changes systems in terms of engaging youth voice to influence decision making that will give way for systems level change in the future is important, but also acknowledging the activist spaces young people are involved in. And when we throw around examples of, you know, the fight for free and accessible education, accessible public transit, when you get specific to post-secondary and education needs in terms of advocating for better policy that eradicates anti-Black racism on campuses. So the importance of, you know, yes, we work in these spaces that really invest in the long-term systems level change, but also important to acknowledge that there are spaces where, you know, are mostly occupied by young people that are focused on immediate systems level change, and young people who are the beneficiaries from that acknowledge it from simple decisions made that are public. And I could point to an example where a lot of my student activism was at Ryerson University, and where Ryerson proposed to bring special constables on campus, and students seeing that as a system level decision that would impact racialized, specifically Black and Indigenous students on campus in terms of violence from enforcement. And that there was a lot of protesting, there was a lot of lobbying, and then the decision made in June by Ryerson University to actually stop that program was a system level change that was immediate, that students saw as a hope for, you know, safer campuses in the future. So just summarizing the importance of, you know, really staying the course and investing in the long-term change, but also acknowledging that there are needs for immediate actions in regards to system level change.
I guess it's my opportunity to jump in here. Yeah, so money and power. I mean, that's I have a little phrase. You always follow the money, right? Probably from some movie somewhere, and that's a good rule of thumb, Ilona. And to your point around power sharing, yeah, where's the power centered? And it's been my experience that is the hardest thing for governments, for agencies, for people to give up, and they will hang on to that very, very much. So in terms of what systems change means, there are so many systems going on. I like Sharif's model of embracing sort of complex systems theory, and a little phrase in the back of my head is you know, embrace complexity and trust uncertainty. And it's been my experience that I can't always predict when systems change will come about. It's all around us, it's happening all the time, but our interest at the Crime Prevention Council really is, as it pertains to youth, it's youth farthest from opportunities. So you won't hear us use words like marginalized youth or vulnerable persons. We'd be more likely to say people farthest from opportunity, or people marginalized by structures and systems. Like, it's not an accident that folks end up in the situations that they do. It's often a result of structural violence, structural discrimination. And my focus, I mean, I've seen systems change, and I've been a part of it. Sometimes it follows a traditional route. The Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act grew off my desk, and didn't happen right away, but it did happen, and in the end, it followed a traditional route. Other things, say provincial level systems changed. The fact that you can get naloxone through public health units and correctional facilities and pharmacies grew off my desk, but you know, it was messy, and it was straight up obstruction for about a decade before that system moved. And the day it moved, it went down like this. There was an article in the Globe and Mail. It was quoted. It wasn't terribly flattering for the province. And the next day, another article in the Globe and Mail, and the province had reversed their decision and suddenly had embraced naloxone. Not the way you like to do policy making, but sometimes that's the way it goes down. It's been it's been my experience that systems level change always happens from the ground up. It's rarely top down, that it grows out of grassroots. And you know, to Margaret Mead and her comment or quote, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that it ever has, and that's certainly true. So what that means for me and our work at the Crime Prevention Council is really about the process, and that's the upstream aspect of our work. It's an approach where those most affected by policy and programming have to be at the table. And for those who are farther from opportunities, they don't have Zoom, they don't have a computer, whatever it happens to be, really our mission is to ensure that they have all the tools at their disposal necessary to participate. So that whole phrase, you know, out of the disability movement in the 70s, nothing about us without us. Otherwise, it just goes sideways. So that's sort of our focus. And yeah, it's complex, it's messy. And I think Malcolm Gladwell, I mean, he wrote a book called The Tipping Point, and never really sure when everything's going to kind of come together and achieve the kind of structural change that we'd like to see, particularly for those at distance to opportunities. And, you know, this summer with the following George Floyd and the protests there through BLM and others, I mean, we're watching a social movement in action where it's pushing against structures and systems. And in the main, I'm speaking generally, but right across North America, you see tremendous pushback from those systems. And really the challenge, I think, for all of us is how do you crack the system that way, so that power is more equitably distributed and resources flow to where they're most needed. And just to summarize, there was a time when I thought evidence would really shift policymakers and change structures and systems. I now know that it's still important, but that's not what does the trick all the time, right? We know that from you know, general surveys that a third of Canadians don't believe in science if it doesn't align with their beliefs. Like, think about that. If I say to Sharif, you know, 2 + 2 is 4, and that doesn't align with his beliefs, he says, no, it's 2. Like, where do you go from there? And this is the stuff that's starting to surface. So yeah, and you're right, Sharif, you have to be persistent. You know, those naloxone wins, that was 10 years in the trenches trying to get that happen, for example. And the other thing I would say, I mean, we're talking about systems change. My interest, our interest at the council is really that preventions type focus. So getting to root causes and preventing harms before they happen. Those are often a result of structural priorities, and the priorities across the board are focused on downstream interventions. And you know, whether it's emergency rooms or the justice system and so on, we know there's better bang for the buck by getting to those prevention ends. Nonetheless, despite, you know, decades of evidence, it's still a slog. It's really a tough go. So, but 2020, you know, anything can happen, and maybe this is again another piece of that puzzle in shifting structures and systems towards equity. So that's my 2 cents.
I'll add a very quick piece because I think a lot of the panelists have touched on it. And I will just say that I was very fortunate to get the chance to chat with the panelists before today, and we had a bit of a conversation, which really left me thinking about sort of my work. And for folks who I haven't had the chance to meet yet, sort of my first love is in like that youth programming space. And that's where I grew up as a youth. That's where I worked when I was a little older than a youth. And like shifting it into more of these system level pieces. One thing in our conversation to prep for today, Sharif mentioned the idea of not losing sight of the layered components of system level change. And not displacing sort of the local micro stories that sort of weave into what we consider all of these ideas around systems level change. And I know for myself, like I'm definitely guilty of getting stuck sort of in this idea of systems are big. So system change has to be big. So the actions we do in systems change has to be big. But really like thinking back about sort of like some of the spaces I participated as a youth, or some of the spaces that I've worked and been fortunate enough to be a staff working with youth. That might be viewed as a bit more of those like micro spaces, like those are directly impacting what we're seeing at systems level spaces. So really just when thinking about systems change, being like super mindful of what does micro change look like, and how do all of our little micro changes connect to one another and build up into that bigger, broader space of systems level change. And then everything everybody else said, because folks are real smart.
Yeah, I just want to echo what you said, Joanna. At the Students Commission, we use a youth engagement framework, which is really focused on looking at things on 3 levels: individual, social, and system. And there are many examples in history that, you know, and Kwaku, I just want to share that I agree with you in terms of the mix of patience and impatience. We're on the same space here, you know, but I think of like, you know, and unfortunately, the patience is often the people who have to bear the brunt of the patience are those who are furthest away from opportunity. I think of, you know, when I use the term patience, I'm really kind of just saying like, don't give up for those who are trying to make the change, because the change does eventually happen. But it's unfair, frankly. I think, Kwaku, what you've just highlighted for all of us is that it's unfair, frankly, that those who bear the brunt of the impatience, those that bear the brunt of waiting for the system to change are often those who are oppressed by that particular system, right? And, you know, I think about even in my lifetime, you know, as a young person, being LGBTQ was not really accepted, even in an urban context like I grew up in. I was an adult once you know, same-sex marriage became legal in this country, and that required a lot of persistent change for that to happen. And you know, now it's some, you know, last year I had the opportunity to get married. I got married last year, which was great. Thank God before all this happened, I got married, and you know, we started the marriage off by just acknowledging all of the like the wedding ceremony off by acknowledging all the folks who came before us, who made it possible for us to actually have that wedding, right? And it's just important to remember that that on an individual, social, and system level is where the changes can happen, and then the role that folks can play in terms of aggregating those changes so that they start to influence the overall system. Another really good example of this is, you know, climate change, okay? And what happened when, you know, a certain person got elected, who will not be named, got elected and, you know, withdrew from the Paris Agreement. A bunch of states and local regions adopted the Paris Agreement and have actually moved miles in terms of affecting systems changes in the space that they can. Obviously, it would be better if the whole country and, you know, south of us adopted the agreement and put in place those changes. But it's you know, let's not make perfection the enemy of the good here, right? Of the fact that local leaders, a lot of them young people, stepped forward and said, we want to take action on climate change, is a really good example of how we don't want systems change to become so big that we're just afraid to tackle it, if that makes sense, right? So I just wanted to emphasize your point there, Joanna, about the importance of, you know, being able to manage what you can within the structures that you have, the young people you interact with, the organizations you work with. You know, this in itself is a system. This table is a system, and the fact that you've, you know, that I keep jumping on the identity questions, but that is a massive system change to ask panelists to place themselves in their identity. That would have been unheard of even a year ago, I think, in a number of these public spaces, and that's a massive systems change. Is it one that's happening for the whole country? Maybe not yet, but this will aggregate itself as more and more people continue to do it. We've never done it before at Students Commission, and now we're going to take that to our system and maybe start to put it in place, right? So that is the kind of multiplier effect that tends to happen, that has to be really, that sometimes gets overlooked because we're looking for that quick win at the top, if that makes sense. And there's lots of small wins that aggregate into that quick win that should be acknowledged.
Perfect. Thanks, Sharif, and all the rest of the panelists. That's a good transition to go into our next question there. When talking about systems levels change, we kind of discussed the major themes of how it's layered and how it can be implemented within different spaces. And when we are trying to implement these changes, whether it be on a larger scale or if it just be within these micro spaces, what are some things that we should be mindful of when doing this type of work and when engaging within these spaces to create system level changes?
I'll jump in first. Just really, I mean, there's lots of things to be mindful of. One that comes to top of mind for me these days is around the safety of people involved in systems level change. So, you know, changing from cupcakes to muffins at a community center, not so controversial. Making requests to, say, reallocate funds out of enforcement budgets to community groups, quite controversial. Less controversial today than 10 years ago, but still can come at a price. So advocating, it's been my experience that advocating for structural change makes you vulnerable on an individual level. It can make your organization quite vulnerable. And for those at a distance to opportunities, extremely vulnerable, right? There's a price to be paid. And you see it playing out. I mean, part of my specialty is really more in drug-related issues, but to the point where, let me see, like right across Canada in different municipalities, you see people like outreach workers, people who use drugs, peer workers, that kind of stuff, being subjected to straight up violence that happens locally and beyond. And they're just, you know, they're just trying to hand out a clean syringe or whatever it happens to be. The system, whatever that is, that structure that you may be looking to change, I mean, its natural reflex is to push back, right? And I think we're into, maybe it's always been there, I don't know, but I mean, for those of you who are paying attention, you know, to things happening in the White House, I would say it's not just in Washington, it's here in Canada as well, where you know, it feels like George Orwell's 1984, war is peace, freedom is slavery, that kind of stuff, where the truth is very much a risky proposition. So speaking truth to power, yeah, it makes you vulnerable. So I think that should be top of mind for those of us who are engaged in systems change, structural level stuff, how to ensure the safety of those involved, including organizations. And different people can say different things, right? As a staff person in a government agency, often quite limited in what they say, but in a community, more empowered to say, speak truth to power, for example. But that's certainly top of mind these days for me. No small thing.
To add on, Michael said, you said something really important about with truth, and I feel like it's important for us to look at ourselves as some sort of system as well. And when we take into consideration that once we're engaging system level change, whether less so, to be honest, from the youth perspective, and more so if you're an adult ally or somebody playing a role in some sort of sector, what do you risk losing in the long run? What's in regards to that truth? And so I'm specifically talking on the lens of anti-racism and the work that a lot of organizations are doing now with anti-racism work in regards to this system level change is going to hinder on whatever the idea of what your privilege is in society. And so knowing that truth and acknowledging the truth on the other side in terms of like a lot of good is coming out of this for younger people, but from our end, what does that really mean for us? Because that really challenges integrity, and that challenges intention, and then challenges why of what we're really doing here. And that's something small just to keep in mind. Yeah.
I'll go, but I'm also trying to let others go. So, Joanna, you were going to go, right? Or Alona?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Kwaku, you sort of ended it with it's just something small, but I actually think it's something really big. And I firmly believe that adults have a lot of work to do in the youth engagement space, like a lot of work to do around sort of like understanding our role as adults in that youth engagement space, our biases that we're bringing in, the power structures we're working within, sort of all of these different pieces. And I think your question around like what do you like sort of around like I can't remember exactly how you framed it, but that like what do you have to lose, or sort of like what's your stake in this conversation is like a really big one and a really important one for folks to be thinking about when engaging in that work. And then not only for yourself, but it's also like doing that work around like the power structures you're working within too, because I have every time I sort of walk into a youth engagement space, I have Alona's voice in my head saying, connecting young people to decision makers. So thank you, Alona, for that voice in my head every time I walk into youth engagement spaces. But that idea of like being in that connector space, if that's the space you're in, and even sort of youth in that connector space, you will most likely be connecting folks who aren't on the same youth engagement journey, or it's sort of that same learning practice as you are. So you as that person being that connector space, having to have done some of that work to figure out your own stuff, because you're also probably going to have to do that work to sort of figure out someone else's stuff or help somebody figure out what that stuff looks like to really engage in that sort of like power sharing dynamic.
Awesome. So I would, echo what everybody has said, and certainly understanding power, and doing like this is a lot of individual work. Like I think, we need to, as Joanna said, do our own work before we can do this systems change work. Some tangible things. So we did at the Youth and Innovation Project, we did a research study that looked at the last 35 years of youth-led impact in the Canadian context and pulled out lessons learned about how young leaders can amplify their impact. And so just some very tangible things to keep in mind if we're going to support young people in having systems change level impact. Again, both doing that with them, but also encouraging them and supporting them to amplify their impact. So just very concretely, one of the things to keep in mind is this work is not just about raising awareness. As Joanna said, the voice, I'm gonna, echo what I say all the time, repeat myself. This is really about influencing decision makers. So the research is very clear that young leaders have the most impact when they don't just work on raising awareness, but they are actually connected with decision makers and working to influence those decision makers. So that's one thing. Thinking like a movement. So really recognizing, and I think Michael spoke to this as well, like recognizing who has more to lose, who can speak up, who can't speak up quite as much, and how can we all work together, and what strategies can we all use, and what resources do we all have to contribute to the movement. So again, that's really about intergenerational partnership as well, right? Recognizing what strengths young people have and maybe what strengths other folks in the movement might have. And another thing is, again, really encouraging young people to not be afraid of working within the system. So, again, what the research is really clear about is actually in the last 35 years, young people who've had the most impact on systems change policy work worked with the wings of political parties. So gay marriage is an example of that, right? It was the youth wing of a political party that actually got that ball rolling, in terms of actually changing the legislation. Obviously, there was a movement before that. There was there was a lot of other things that happened that kind of led to that, but that was a really fundamental piece of that movement. So working with political parties, not being afraid of being on advisory boards, not being afraid of really engaging with the system. So anyway, those just are some concrete things that I think we can all keep in mind as we support young people and also work in intergenerational partnership in the context of systems change versus just program-based work.
Thanks, Ilona. So just on kind of the timing wise, we're going to open it up to some questions from the audience. So if you want to ask a question, you can either drop it in the chat or feel free to unmute and ask the question. Yeah. If we don't have any questions, we can continue with the rest of the questions I had, but feel free if you have any questions to just drop them in the chat and then we can come back to them later on. But thank you, Ilona. You were specifically talking about how it's more important to not only raise awareness, but to continue to actually have those changes be made. And as a young person in those spaces, I definitely agree, just in terms of like, it's easy sometimes to be performative and to show like, oh, we have a youth advisory council, but then the stuff that happens in that council doesn't really go anywhere in terms of changing the system. So it's good to hear that that's something we should all keep in mind, is how we can move from kind of those awareness spaces to bringing it to that system level to make a true big difference within organizational changes. So on that note, with all these things in mind, what are some things that we can do to celebrate, and when do we know when to celebrate throughout this process?
Before we get to the celebration, I think there are 3 ways in which folks on this call can immediately engage in systems change, and then you can celebrate with like a big party at your house if you want, socially distanced, of course. Number 1, it would be to ensure that you view young people as partners, not recipients. That's an easy statement, but it's really hard because our society, you know, regardless of all the isms that are at play, we actually have a ageism as a big one, where we see young people as things, frankly, to be coddled, supported, that they can't, with lack of agency, frankly, and you know, everything in the work that I've done has over the years and from the research has shown that, you know, when young people are seen as partners, better outcomes happen, not just for the young people, but for any of the people working with them, other young people, adults, systems. And so number 1, I would, you know, shifting to thinking about young people as partners rather than recipients of something. The second is to turn, as adults when working with youth, to turn every statement in your head into a question. You immediately shift the power to Alona's definition, not your, you know, the one you shared, Alona. I know it's not yours officially, but the one you shared around power being a key marker of systems change. You immediately affect your microsystem when you shift the statement in your head into your question. Again, easier said than done. It's really hard. I'm telling you this advice like I've been able to do it easy. Not at all. It's really, really, really hard. The third thing is the importance of allies from the dominant group to step forward and ensure that those who are not in the dominant group are always taking the blows for system change. The education required for system change to happen is not is on the people who need to change, not on those who are marginalized. And oftentimes we ask those folks to give away their free labor to tell us. And so, for example, I invited Kwaku here today, and he's being paid for this time as a young person to be here, because that's, you know, part of the kind of equity that we want to have here. It's not. We've often found that sometimes adults are expecting youth, because they're younger and they're trying to make their way in society, to do things for free and to, you know, to give their time away. And we especially see this happening for those who have other elements of their identity that make them furthest away from opportunity, as Michael described. So it's really important to make sure that we don't put the burden of the systems change on those who are needing the system to change, and that there are really great allies in place. And frankly, with all due respect, to some folks probably on this call, that looks like a cisgendered, straight, white male stepping forward to take a stand with and be an ally to the folks who tend to be marginalized in our society. It doesn't mean that others can't be on the front lines. It just means that we need those supporters to be able to help things, to help the systems change. And frankly, when you talk about in history, I was thinking about carding in Toronto, for example, and I read the whole system change on how that happened. And it basically was John Tory's straight white male friend in Toronto that told him carding needed to stop, even though all these activists had come forward and tried to change it, which finally made that happen. I'm not saying it's fair, but to Alona's point, it's around making sure that we have an activist space and within the system space, and the activists connected with this influencer of John Tory, and then things really started to change, right? So it's making those linkages really clear and finding those allies who can help to move the needle on some of the systems. So then when you do those three things, feel free to celebrate in a socially distanced way. I see a question.
Yeah, let's just get to the question. Thanks for sharing, Sharif. I definitely agree with the points that you're saying about connecting those activism pieces to empowering youth, so that we're getting also somebody that's already in power or somebody that already has influence to kind of reach that end goal. So the question we have here is, how would you suggest going about connecting youth to systems/spaces where you are not sure of their youth engagement approach? To ensure that those spaces are not just performative or tokenist, any key questions to ask those spaces before connection, or to frame that for youth? So kind of going around, how can we make these spaces so that youth are engaged in a way that is affecting system levels change and is not just kind of performative and tokenistic? So anyone have any insight for that?
I can jump in here. I see that Sharif's adding some great points that I would certainly echo in the chat. But one of the things I just think we have this tendency in Western culture to think that young people, we overprotect young people. So what I would say is it's about supporting young people to go into difficult spaces. It's not about protecting them from those spaces. So it's about creating, so we did a research report for the Canada Service Corps looking at how do service programs how do they promote lifelong citizenship? And one of the things was creating real space for reflection, and when young people were reflecting on their service experiences, connecting that to broader social issues. So I would say the same would go for if young people are going to engage with a space that might be tokenistic and might be performative, how can you create space for reflection after that experience where they feel really supported, and they have an opportunity to say, wow, okay, so I met with that politician and I felt that they just gave me their spiel and they really didn't care what I had to say. And then there's an opportunity to think about, how that young person might have more agency, moving forward, or how that relationship could shift. So I would just be very careful about overprotecting young people, but rather encouraging them to go into difficult spaces, sit at those tables, be there, but then really making sure that they have the support to really deconstruct what happened in that context.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely agree with that sense. As a young person, just having people or having adults be in that supportive role where they're kind of helping youth realize their potential, because sometimes as a young person, you feel like, oh, you can't do certain things because this is not what young people do. You'll have to wait until you're older, but it's kind of changing that mindset even within young people themselves to make them realize no, you don't have to wait to make a difference, or you don't have to wait to make an impact, because what you carry and your insight that you have now is valuable. So hopefully that answers that question. So that wraps up our session. Thank you so much to all the panelists for the amazing insight, and as well as thank you to everyone that came. We hope you learned something and that you're able to carry this out towards the work that you do. Thank you.
Thank you all. That was amazing and wonderful. And I bet we could have stayed here for like 2 more hours and, you know, just enjoyed that banter and enjoy coming together around this topic. I haven't typed it, but if you have a chance to throw an insight or two into the chat that you're hearing something that you're thinking from this session, hey, I'm going to bring that into my day-to-day work, or hey, as a collective, let's really focus in on this. It's really meaningful and impactful. I'd really encourage you to do that. Definitely just want to share back, I'm hearing in that thread of power. Power has been interwoven, I would say, throughout the day. And another piece for me that's just standing out is the humanity piece, like this notion that we're talking about people trying to do good things with other people, and the respect that calls for, and the messaging of how you matter is called for. And I'm just quite enjoying the different pieces everyone threw in. And so Neha and Kwaku and Alona, and Michael and Sharif, I think I got everyone. I hope I got everyone. It's been such a great honor to have you all in one space and for us to be able to share with you in it. So thank you again so much. And thanks for everyone for making the time to be here in this hour.